I feel bad for Indiana. They've had a great year. And I hope for them to be ranked 12th in this week's standings, I think the committee is taking into account the injury to Michael Penix and the idea that they may not be a top 10 team going forward, but their body of work and what they've done matches up with just about anybody, above them, with the exception of the unbeaten teams. So for them to have a twice beaten Georgia or a twice beaten Oklahoma ahead of them doesn't make any sense to me. Iowa State, maybe. There's 3 2-loss teams ahead of Indiana, who only has 1 loss. Georgia is one that I continue to they haven't beaten a team that's currently ranked in the top 25, and their 2 losses, they were double-digit losses. They got trounced by Alabama and Florida, 2 very good teams, obviously, but
their recruiting ranking, Steve, is really good, though, every year.
Yeah, I mean, last night I'm watching The Drive on Big Ten, and Dave Rebson, Bruce Feldman was breaking it down, and he had just kind of a snide comment about the committee's affinity for Georgia. And Bruce Feldman, they go back to the 2-shot from a 1-shot of Feldman, and Rever is just like doubled over laughing like this, doesn't know that he's on camera. That's how much he was laughing about it. It's like a weekly gag for them. But a couple anomalies. I think Cincinnati got some short shrift here, although they haven't been able to get on the field in recent weeks, and that has kind of hurt. They've been stalled at 8-0 for what seems like 4 weeks now. So they are finally going to get to play Tulsa next week and hopefully earn a New Year's 6 spot. I think Coastal Carolina, if they end up undefeated, deserves to be in the New Year's 6. And I definitely believe Indiana, if they play next week and win, should be in the New Year's 6 as well. So, enough of these retreads. Get some fresh blood into these major bowls and let's see what they have to offer is kind of my thought.
I do want to get into the college football playoff rankings. Steve dove into it to a certain extent, and when Steve goes for it, then we just let him go. But I want to get back to it here. And I can't believe that we're going to let like 45 or 50 minutes expire before we actually address not playing Michigan, but that's the world we live in. Got to move on to the next thing. So the college football playoff rankings. Yeah, Iowa State is number 7. Indiana's number 12.
Mm-hmm. I remember Indiana's 17-point loss to Ball State. I remember that. What a joke.
Exactly. Which could be much like, Iowa State's 17-point loss to Louisiana. And the inconsistencies have gone week to week in this. And I know it's a difficult process, a difficult thing to do. But from the beginning of these rankings, Iowa State at one point was 10 spots higher than an Oklahoma State team. So it's not necessarily that I think that they're favoring conferences other than the SEC. But Iowa State was 10 slots ahead of an Oklahoma State team where they had the same record. And Oklahoma State beat them head-to-head. Did not have the 17-point loss against Louisiana, but had a good non-conference win against Tulsa. And if you looked at their schedules, they were almost identical because they play in the Big 12 and they're playing all conference games except for the one game. And it's like 10 spots. What's that? They're all over the place. With Northwest, it's just, I can't even. I'll just give that one example because I could continue, Kevin.
Yeah, I sort of lightly watched it because I didn't expect to see any change in the top 6, and we didn't. And everything else that kind of happens is par for the course. And once again, it goes to show that these football minds either outthink themselves or don't think enough about these situations. Oklahoma at 11 still kind of bothers me at this point. I just think I don't know. I mean, there are a lot of teams, and I'm looking at the rankings. That's what I'm looking at right now. That just things don't make a lot of sense to me in terms of what it is that they value, what they don't value. I think they value things for teams out of certain conferences that they don't value for teams out of other conferences. I don't know. I just think it's a mess, and we just need to get to the 20th when the final rankings come out. We see the final 4. I think we have a pretty good idea of what they're going to largely look like at that point, barring some crazy upsets. And, the good news is the national semifinals are January 1st, 2021. And that'll be a new year, at least in terms of what it says on the calendar. And maybe we can start things off on a little bit of a better foot.
And Steve, will cut you loose, but I didn't have so much an issue with the top 4, Ohio State staying at 4, even though they're an undefeated team behind a 1-loss team. It was a great loss or whatever, an understandable loss in South Bend or whatever. It was more the rhetoric of the conversation with the committee chair it was like 80% Ohio State. Is Ohio State playing enough games? What about Ohio State? Just this laser focus on questioning Ohio State's resume.
Yeah, I have to say in their defense, it is a complete apples to oranges comparison when you talk about a team that's played 9 or 10 games against a team that's only played 5 or 6. One team's only played half as many games. And I understand that. I get that. I think that we all entered this season from the beginning when the Big Ten finally relented and said, okay, we're going to play. I was of the mind that the college football world was like, thankfully, great. Now everybody's here and we can crown a true universal, all 5 Power 5 conferences involved national champion. And everyone was happy about that. And going into it with both eyes open down the field, knowing that it was going to be imperfect, much as 2020 has been completely an imperfect year. This is an imperfect solution to the season. I didn't get the sense back in September and October that they were going to hold the number of games you played against you. I've always been an advocate and a thought, people have talked about Notre Dame is never in a conference. Well, they haven't been up until this year. So their season usually ends after game 12, whereas everybody else gets that extra data point, to make it 13 games. And I have never subscribed to that theory because this is what I believe and this is what I'm going to do. I'm going to take the schedules of the top 6 or 7 teams and I'm going to lay them out and I'm going to assign the college football playoff ranking to every opponent. Then I'm going to look at Jeff Sagarin or whoever from 1 to 100 and assign a numerical value to everybody else after that. And I could pretty much tell you without looking that when this thing is all said and done and Ohio State's played one more ranked team at the end of this thing next week, that Ohio State's going to have played 2 ranked teams. Alabama's going to have played 2 or 3 ranked teams. Clemson's have played 2 or 3, 4 ranked teams, whatever. It's going to be very comparable. And when you get to the bottom of Ohio State's list at number 6, 70, 75, 80, whatever those other teams are, those are going to be the similar numbers that you're going to see from Alabama's opponents from 5 down to 11. 75, 80, 85, 90, 95, 100. Those games mean nothing. Those games mean nothing. I want the teams ranked on the top 6 or 7 opponents that they played. Anything below that was just a personal appearance down at the mall signing autographs is all that was. That meant nothing. And Ohio State to not have beaten Maryland by 5 touchdowns or Michigan by 5 touchdowns or Illinois by 5 touchdowns doesn't mean anything. They would have been lapped right alongside games 8, 9, and 10 from Alabama. Meaningless. So rank the teams based on how they did against the best 6 or 7 teams on their schedule. Give me a comparable on that. I don't need to know that you beat Wofford in week 2. I don't need to know that. I don't care that you beat Charleston Southern in the tune-up game back on September the 8th. I don't need to know that. I don't care. It was immaterial. It doesn't factor into my thought on the relative worth of these teams. So that's my soapbox on that.
Before Tony goes, to your point, Steve, I hate the way the strength of schedule works because let's say you've played 2 games and somebody else has played 2 games. If you're a good team, you don't care if you played team number 80 or team number 120. It's about the same deal. If you're Ohio State, big deal. But the strength of schedule works out that if you play the number 1 team in the country and you play the number 130 team in the country, you played a 65th ranked schedule. Well, if you play number 65 and number 66, you've played a number 60. It's the same. No, it's not the same thing if you played Alabama and Akron versus playing like UAB and Louisiana. Yeah,
I give them credit. I give the ones at the top some credit. Clemson will have played Notre Dame twice, and North Carolina, who's pretty good. And, beyond that, I don't know. I guess they played Miami, who's top 10. So there's 4 pretty good games. I give them credit. We didn't think their schedule was worth a crap, but it turned out, thankfully to them, Miami, North Carolina beat up on pretty much everybody else that they played. And so those games look good for them. Alabama, I don't have their schedule in front of me. Georgia, my whipping boy, my God, they snuck freaking Missouri in there at number 24 to prop up the SEC or whatever this week. And I'm just like, like, are you serious? I rank the teams every week in my column. I do 25 ranked teams and like 6 or 7 more that I'm considering. The name Missouri has never once come up in my thoughts. Not one time. And the freaking committee put them in at 24.
Missouri do it every year. They do it every year. They throw a team in at 25 just to justify some sort of moves. It's
Colorado State last year. They bumped them in at 25 because Alabama had played them back 8 weeks earlier.
Missouri's got 5. Any win's a good win, but they've got 5 wins against bad teams. They haven't beaten a team with a winning record, and they've got a loss to a 2-win Tennessee team by 4 scores.
Yeah.
All right, Tom.
It's like Maryland. I'll stop talking and let somebody else speak. But a few weeks ago, Maryland was 2-1, and the loss was like a 30-point loss to Northwestern. And somebody in the coaches poll had given them votes, like Mike Loxley and whoever Mike Loxley's best friends are in coaching had somehow put Maryland at like 25 on their ballot. They didn't deserve to be 25 on anybody's ballot more than the man in the moon. So that's my thought.
But what the committee does is just so shameless. 5-3, Missouri is now 25. But Mark, you mentioned Georgia having beaten no top 25 teams. When on the CFP call last night with the committee with Gary Barta, he was asked, why didn't Indiana move up after having a good win with a backup quarterback? And he said, well, Indiana has no wins over top 25 teams, and all of their wins are against teams that aren't over 500. But Georgia with 2 losses and no top 25 wins they can't budge them out of that top 10. And it's so standard. It's so predictable. It's very tiresome because it happens every year. Georgia for some reason. And then the other thing I want to go off on is Reese Davis last night. Now, I know everybody knows Reese Davis, host of the College Football Playoff Rankings show. That, as you mentioned, Mark, that show was so much focused on Ohio State. And at one point, Reese Davis talking about Ohio State, if they don't play this week and they make it in as a 6-0 team, you can't keep giving Ohio State everything. You can't give Ohio State everything. And then he says if Florida beats Alabama and if Clemson beats Notre Dame, then it should be Clemson, Alabama, Florida, Notre Dame. Like those Alabama and Notre Dame should be in the playoffs for losing. And so it's like, who are you giving everything to? Are you giving everything to an Ohio State team that is undefeated and won its way in? Or are you giving everything to Alabama, who loses and makes the playoffs, and Notre Dame, who loses and then makes the playoffs? Who exactly are you giving everything to? Because Ohio State has not played as many games as everybody else, but I still am totally against losing your way in. And I can't stand the attitude of you're giving Ohio State everything. And then he also mentions, and remember what Ohio State did in 2017 and 2018, with a full regular season of losing to Iowa and Purdue. What does that have to do with anything? And why, if you're going to bring up 2017 and 2018, why don't you bring up Notre Dame and their 2017 and 2018? They had blowouts both of those years. One of those blowouts to Clemson in the playoffs. 1 year, 2 blowouts in their regular season, and it's tiresome the way the attitude of, I don't understand giving Ohio State everything when Ohio State is trying to find games to play, is doing what they can, is not losing its way in. Nobody is saying if Ohio State loses, they should be in. And yet if Notre Dame loses and if Alabama loses, they should stay in. Because why? Because your preconceived notion is that these are the best teams, and why should that change? We all know that Alabama is the best, and losses do not count for Alabama. We know this, but they should count for Notre Dame, because Notre Dame loses every year, and it is expected. And if it happens in the playoffs again, you're like, well, of course we should have seen this coming. It's like when Oklahoma is in the playoffs, and then it's like, well, who are the idiots that put Oklahoma in the playoffs when we knew what was going to happen?
Well, they need to sit there. I mean, obviously, under that scenario, it's 2 ACC teams, and it's weird calling Notre Dame an ACC team, and 2 SEC teams. The other 3 conferences would say, screw it. We're out of here. We're done. We're breaking up the band. I quit. Because it's the same crap every single time. And it's funny that the 4-letter network has, its hooks in the SEC and the ACC networks, and those are the conferences that they seem to like to prop up. And I'm sorry that I took my tinfoil hat off before I got on the air here, but it sure seems like a level of malfeasance that's going on there. A lot of agenda-driven stuff, and I'm sick of it. I really am sick of it. And there is part of me that almost hopes that Armageddon happens. It forces the CFP to show its true colors, and we can break up this flawed system, because right now it's a farce. It is an absolute farce. We could just pick the 4 teams before we even start the season, or at least the 4 teams that ESPN and the CFP want to have the candidacy for, and it's evidenced by Georgia still really not going anywhere. I mean, I'm sure there's probably a situation on 538, Nate Silver's thing, where if 4 or 5 things happen, Georgia's probably the 1 seed, for Christ's sake. So, I'm done with it. I'm done with it.
I'm self-employed now, Kevin. You're good to go.
A couple months ago, I wouldn't have gone off as far on that path as I did.
One of the things, because we were on the college football call last night, and I swear everybody on the Ohio State beat got called on except for me. And what I wanted to ask is, how do you make sure you're not punishing the programs who are taking the COVID pandemic more seriously than others? How do you make sure you're not punishing an Ohio State for being cautious during a pandemic? And I would like to hear the answer, because there's no real good answer other than, well, we can't punish them, and so they're in the playoffs, basically. Because if you hold them out, you are punishing them. And yes, it is difficult to tell who's better when you see one team playing 6 games and another team playing 10 games. But when you compare Texas A&M and Ohio State, you shouldn't have that much trouble. And if you're seeing, and I still think you should not lose your conference championship game and go to the playoffs. I know the college football playoffs, they don't like to have rules. They don't like to put in their own rules. For me, if I'm college football czar, that's one of them. Until this is an 8-team playoff, you should not be able to lose your way in. And then it just becomes, it's an invitational. It's already an invitational where it's 2 or 3 teams and 1 or 2 teams get in, make their way into the playoffs. But I just, if you can lose your way in, I'm with Kevin. Just let's see 2 ACC teams, 2 SEC teams go in there and see what happens.
So you set me up for my next question, because I was going to ask all of you. It's conventional thought that Ohio State wins out. They're in, no questions. They're at number 4. How do they get trumped by a team that's lower in the rankings if Ohio State goes and wins? Hopefully Northwestern can hold serve against Illinois. The way the Wildcats play football, I have great respect for them, but we saw what happened in Michigan State, and it didn't surprise me, because once they arrived at that 3-game stretch undefeated at 5-0, I clearly said they're going to lose one of these 3 games. It's just Northwestern. So anyway, they already got that out of the way. Hopefully they don't show up with a 5-2 record against Ohio State. They can hold serve, keep their whatever they are, 14 or 15 ranking, and so it's a decent win for the Buckeyes. But how does Ohio State not get into the playoffs, winning the conference, checking that off, finishing undefeated, beating a ranked team in the process? But do you guys have your reservations about the ACC and the SEC shutting everyone else out if, as Kevin put it, Florida beats Alabama, Notre Dame or Clemson beats Notre Dame, and we've got this this gridlock between those two conferences and they shove them into the first four. How likely is that?
That's a tough dilemma right there. Again, you're talking about apples and oranges, and I guess if you had to deconstruct each team's resume, I I agree in principle with what Tony was saying, that, okay, if you lose your last game, this conference championship, that maybe you don't deserve to be in the playoff. Alabama did get away with that the one year. Didn't they lose to Georgia and then came back and beat them in the playoff? Maybe the championship game, I guess. I don't like absolutes because there is no one-size-fits-all solution. Every season is an animal unto itself with different teams, different number of unbeaten teams, different number of one-loss teams, different teams that had goofy breaks like Trevor Lawrence missing games because of COVID. But if I had to deconstruct the resumes of Florida, Notre Dame, Alabama, and Clemson, the odd man out to me is Notre Dame, because you kind of poke a hole in their best win being Clemson without Trevor Lawrence. I think Florida lost on the road to Texas A&M, who is a top 10 team. And it was a close game. It was a good game, as I recall. I don't know. I guess it's the nature of how these teams might lose next week. If one of them loses by 3 touchdowns, then I think you have to call it into tremendous question. I was doing a radio show this morning, and we were asked about, I think Anthony Schlegel on 97.1 asked me, does Ohio State need to win big over Northwestern and have style points? And I said, well, go back to 2014. You had TCU and Baylor who weren't playing because they didn't have a championship game. And Ohio State needed to have an impressive showing and did. They won 59-0 over Wisconsin, and that put them in. Fast forward 3 years, Wisconsin was 12-0 and undefeated. And you'd think, well, just a 3-2 win over a 12-0 team would put you in. And I remember talking to Jared Smalley on Channel 4 before the game, and I said, no, they need to play well because there are teams nipping at their heels, and they didn't. JT Barrett turned it over 3 times, and they won on criteria, 27-21, like a wrestling match that's gone 8 minutes, and they look to see who had the most takedowns. I mean, that how bad it was. And to me, next week, Ohio State would help their cause to go out and just blow Northwestern out. And, we'll see if that's possible or not. It really wasn't 2 or 3 years ago when they played them. It was a close game for a while. And then the cream rose to the top in the fourth quarter. I think they won by 17 finally, but it'd probably be about the same type game, I would guess.
And I think 45-24. Does that sound?
Yeah, something like that.
Right. Yeah.
About as exciting as watching paint dry. But, Ohio State had a couple big plays in that game. The deep ball to Terry McLaurin, the Indianapolis native, that was kind of cool for him to catch that pass at Lucas Oil Stadium where he grew up, in his hometown. But there wasn't a lot of excitement surrounding that game. And poor Northwestern, it was like Stockholm syndrome for those people. They had 5,000 people out of 65,000. They had this little purple covenant of people over in the corner. When they get a first down, you'd hear a distant roar off in the distance. And then they'd shut up for the next 20 minutes, and that was that.